So greetings from Pennsylvania once again, and today is Labor Day. At least for me, it is today. I know by the time this video comes up, Labor Day will be long gone already. And we're also trying to beat the rain today. Some rain is on the way, but we'll get this video done, hopefully, before the rain comes down. So as you can tell by the title of this video, this is another one of my biographical videos for my French and Indian War series in Pennsylvania, and the topic is George Washington. And of course, we've talked about him quite a bit in this series already. You know, we were over at Jumonville, Glen, Fort Necessity. When we did Braddock's expedition, he was already part of all those videos. So I feel like I should have done this biography earlier, but we're going to do it now because I'm also preparing for the Forbes Expedition. Getting ready to film that sometime soon here. I'll probably film that in several parts. So yeah, and also, there's no lack of stuff to say about George Washington, but this is the French and Indian War in Pennsylvania. So we're only focusing on, number one, his career in the French and Indian War, and only the part that took place in Pennsylvania for him. He was involved in the French and Indian War down in Virginia as well, and obviously involved in other wars besides the French and Indian War. But we're just concentrating on those aspects of it. So the start of the French and Indian War, by many, is considered to have been started by George Washington during the Jumonville Glen skirmish, or affair, as it's called by some, because we filmed that location already and told that whole story. But we'll talk a little bit about it later in this video too. But our story begins a year earlier than that, back in 1753, and that was Washington's first foray into what is now considered Western Pennsylvania. Because one important thing to remember about this time era is that the location of Pittsburgh, in what is now Western Pennsylvania, all the way up to Lake Erie, was kind of contested territory. Virginia claimed all that territory for itself. Pennsylvania also did, and even Maryland claimed parts of that territory. So there was a conflict of interest between those three states. Well, they were actually states, yet those three colonies for that area. It actually did have an effect on the French and Indian War and their ability to collaborate with each other, the different colonies and troops, because they all had differing interests in that area. But I'll probably talk about those difficulties in a later video when I do Forbes Expedition, because that did play a big part in their ability to defend themselves from the French and the Indians. They're kind of squabbling over the territory at the same time. It had a big effect on which road General Forbes took on his expedition to Pittsburgh, so we'll save that for those videos. But yeah, in 1753, the lieutenant governor of Virginia, Robert Dinwiddie, he was just a lieutenant governor at the time. Of course, Virginia had a vested interest in the area, and they knew the French had claims to the territory too, so they were interested in knowing what the French were doing in the area. Were they building forts? What were their plans? What were they doing? And they wanted to first they were looking to send an armed expedition up there. But they couldn't get the funds for an armed expedition. I guess their intent for that was to explore the area, and if they found any French in the area building forts, they would expel them from the area. But they decided to still send, an emissary to the area to talk with the French to see what they're doing, and also to, obviously, spy on them as well. And George Washington volunteered for that position. And he was also pretty young at this time. He was only about 20, I think, roughly, at this time when he volunteered for that position. So his job was to take a letter from the governor, or the lieutenant governor, Dinwiddie, to a French commander out that way, because the French were building forts out that way. We'll talk about that in a moment. To deliver a letter to them, and in the letter, he's kind of asking them, hey, what's your purpose out here? What are you intending on doing? All that kind of stuff. But like I said, the secondary aspect of it was for Washington to kind of spy on the French, see how many numbers they had, troop-wise, what their plans were, size of the forts they were building, all that kind of stuff as well. Now, the French already had built 3 forts out in that area. There was Fort Presque Isle right along Lake Erie, close to where Presque Isle State Park is right now. There was Fort Le Boeuf, and a little bit further south was Fort Machault. Of course, they were on their way to build a fort down in modern-day Pittsburgh too, which would become Fort Duquesne. So in 1753, George Washington made his way to the first of the French forts, which at that time was Fort Machault. Fort Duquesne had not been started yet, because they were making their way down towards Pittsburgh. And I should mention too that on his way to the French forts, he met up with a local Indian chief. His English name, he was called Half King. I'm not going to attempt to say his Indian name. I'll put it down here though. So he met up with a chief called Half King. He was kind of his guide and kind of, you know, took him to where the French forts were. But the commander at Fort Machault would not read the letter from the Virginia governor and sent him on to the regional commander who was at the next fort to the north, Fort Le Boeuf. And of course, all along the way, remember, Washington is kind of like spying, you know, seeing what the forts look like, you know, do they have cannons there, how many troops they have there, trying to ascertain what their plans were, things like that. So he did meet with the commander, or the regional commander at Fort Le Boeuf, got an answer, which is not quite what the Virginians wanted, and he took that answer back to Virginia, made his way back there in January of 1754. Of course, not too long after that, he got sent back in the spring of 1754 to kind of confront the French. He took troops with him this time, and of course he was on his way to what they call the, you know, the forks of the Ohio, where Pittsburgh is today, because I guess they got word that the French were building another fort just like they had planned to. And then of course begins our whole story about the Jumonville Glen battle or skirmish, and then the fall of Fort Necessity. Because we filmed all those in the past. We visited Jumonville Glen and Fort Necessity twice within the past year or so. So I'm not going to cover in huge detail what happened there. You can watch those videos. They're in my playlist, which you can find on my homepage, I believe. Of course, but the gist of that story is that, you know, when Washington was back out in the area, he got word from some of his Indian allies that a group of French soldiers were approaching their encampment, which I think was at Great Meadows, where they were building Fort Necessity. And George Washington, his soldiers, and some of his Indian allies then went to confront that French, you know, detention of soldiers, I guess you could say it. And, you know, a little skirmish ensued where the French were defeated and the French commander was killed as well. Of course, the French claimed that they were just on a little diplomatic mission to meet up with Washington, but Washington and his allies felt that they were trying to sneak up on him as too. So there's a bit of a disagreement as to what was really going on. The main problem was that the French commander was killed in that engagement. And there's some disagreements amongst historians and all those people as to exactly what happened during that whole situation. But we discussed that in a previous video. And then of course Washington retreated to Fort Necessity because he realized what was probably going to happen, and what did happen is that the French from Fort Duquesne, which was not too far away, sent a large detachment of French soldiers and their Indian allies to where Washington was encamped at Great Meadows at Fort Necessity. And they had to end up suing for peace. I guess they thought it didn't look good for them anyway, but the French offered terms of peace. Washington accepted, and him and his troops were allowed to leave the area. Otherwise, if the French hadn't offered terms of peace, that could have been it for Washington, actually, because they were running out of ammunition. It was raining, the guns weren't working, it was just not going well for them. They were greatly outnumbered. So if the French hadn't offered terms of peace, you know, this video would end right there. That'd be it for Washington. But that's not how things went. And then, of course, Washington took part in Braddock's expedition in the summer of 1755. We filmed that expedition already, talked a whole lot about that, who Braddock was and his arrogance, and how a lot of that was the reason for the defeat of Braddock's expedition. Kind of a disastrous affair there. But Washington volunteered for that expedition. He had been to the area twice already, so he volunteered as kind of like an aide to Braddock. And it was good that he was along as well. And once again, I'm not going to get into the minor details of Braddock's expedition. We filmed that in quite detail in some previous videos. Actually earlier, that was earlier this summer actually. Back in the spring we did that. And Washington's relationship with Braddock was somewhat complicated, I believe. I mean, Braddock was a bit arrogant and looked down on the colonial troops and stuff like that, but I think Washington in a way looked up to him. There was some degree of friendship between them, even though a lot of times Washington's words about him were a bit, I don't think he quite knew what to say about the general. I think there's some harsh criticism, but also some admiration for him. So I think he had quite some mixed feelings about Braddock. But regardless, at Braddock's defeat, the Battle of Monongahela, Washington is credited with saving what was left of the troops and preparing the retreat, having a more organized retreat. Because during the battle, it was pretty awful. The troops were scattering, and Braddock had been shot off his horse, no longer able to lead the troops. And Washington, even though Washington was not a enlisted officer, he kind of took charge of the retreat and got everybody together and got him out of there. Of course, after Braddock's expedition in 1755, up until 1758, Forbes Expedition, Washington was greatly involved in the French and Indian War in his home colony of Virginia. He was responsible for building a lot of the forts and overseeing their constructions and different things like that. But yeah, like I said, in 1758, we have the Forbes Expedition, which Washington was involved in as well. So it's hinted at several times. We will be doing some videos on the Forbes Expedition in a little bit here, hopefully. But Washington was involved in that, but he didn't join the expedition until later. The expedition actually started around Carlisle, PA, but he didn't join up with them until they reached an area called Fort Bedford. He was kind of stationed down in Fort Cumberland, which was in Maryland at the time, just kind of waiting for the word to join the expedition up into Pennsylvania. And there was some dissension between him and Forbes as to what road they should take to get out to Fort Duquesne, which is the objective of the Forbes Expedition, to take that fort from the French. Of course, earlier in the video, I mentioned how there was some contention between the colonies as to who claimed that territory of what is now Western Pennsylvania. That figured into the Forbes campaign. Washington wanted Forbes to use Braddock's road, which had already been made. It made sense to him. Plus, it started in Virginia and headed up to that area. So and there are other reasons why he wanted him to use that road as well. But Forbes chose otherwise. He chose to make a new road, carve a new road out of the wilderness, starting in Pennsylvania, in eastern Pennsylvania, headed out that way. And there are reasons why. So remember that Washington and Virginia, had vested interests in that area, what's called the Ohio River Valley area there in western Pennsylvania. So they wanted him to use Braddock's road, and of course he would have enlarged it and made it better. And that would have made it easy for many Virginians after the battle to follow that same road and colonize that area, giving Virginia a further claim to the area and allowing them maybe to seize it, hold it for themselves, even to modern times. But Forbes chose to build a road, like I said, from eastern Pennsylvania. And Forbes knew full well why Washington wanted him to use Braddock's road. He knew there were other reasons besides military reasons. But he built his own road. And indeed, then, that is one reason that Pennsylvania was able to claim the area, because after the war, many Pennsylvanians from eastern Pennsylvania then used that road to colonize that area. And Forbes had his own reasons for building a new road. Eastern Pennsylvania had plenty of supplies, lots of horses and grains and things like that would be needed for the expedition. So he thought it best to build the road to start in that area that could greatly supply his expedition out to Fort Duquesne. So that was kind of his reasoning. I think he got a little bit tired of the Virginians claiming that he should use Braddock's road too. In some letters that he wrote, he was kind of getting annoyed at Washington for insisting that they use Braddock's road. And as you probably know, the Forbes expedition was successful in taking Fort Duquesne. The French actually abandoned the fort prior to arriving. They realized they couldn't withstand Forbes and his troops. There are different reasons for that, which we'll discuss in later videos. But Washington was there, once again, at the fall of Fort Duquesne. And of course, he became friends with, we did a video on John Armstrong. We talked about him in previous videos, especially the Kittanning expedition, because him and Washington became friends along that expedition. That's kind of where our story ends. After 1758, that was kind of it for Washington's involvement in the French and Indian War, at least directly militarily. Yeah, so after the Forbes expedition, he returned to Virginia. He got married and joined what they called the House of Burgess, which is kind of like their government, their Senate, or their Congress, if you can think of it that way. And yeah, and then he kind of left the war, at least militarily. So it kind of ends his history of the French and Indian War in Pennsylvania. I don't know if you can hear the rain, but I'm going to have to end this video soon too. The rain is coming. I still got to walk all the way back. What was that? There's boats down there in the lake. And of course, this is obviously just a summary of Washington's career, in the French and Indian War in Pennsylvania. We have talked, in some videos we've gone into more detail about what happened at some of those events, like Fort Necessity, Jumonville Glen, things like that. And we'll talk more about him when we do the Forbes Expedition too. Like I said, all those other videos are in my playlist for the French and Indian War, which you'll find on my homepage. But we gotta get going, that rain is coming. I have my umbrella with too, but still would like to get back to the Jeep before it pours. And it is interesting to note too that a lot of people don't realize just how much time George Washington spent in Pennsylvania. Obviously, if you know the history of the Revolutionary War, he spent a lot of time in Pennsylvania. But even during the French and Indian War, like we're discussing here, he actually spent quite a bit of time in Pennsylvania during his military career. So yeah, I am making plans to film the Forbes Expedition. Probably doing it in several parts. Just might work out logistics wise, because I am teaching again now, so that kind of takes away from some of my time that I have to film on these longer trips. I don't have quite as much time, which is fine. We'll just work our way around it. But I have several more biographies to do. One is John Forbes, the general who led that expedition, and then his second in command, Henry Bouquet. Do those biographies before we do the Forbes Expedition. So that'll be it for this video then. And as always, thanks for coming along. I'm going to try and beat the rain back to the Jeep, and hopefully we'll see you on the next one.